Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Legal Power Hour, where we jam 60 minutes of thought-provoking discussion into a 30-minute show designed to inform, awaken, and protect our fellow American citizens. We are your co-hosts, Tom Scott and Sarah Nahidi, and today it is an absolute pleasure to have with us as our guest, champion of individual freedom and liberty, Mr. Norm Singleton, president of Campaign for Liberty. He has worked with Dr. Ron Paul for many years while Dr. Paul was U.S. Congressman, and I'm sure his experiences in depth with Mr. Paul and the work that he's done is certainly great for everyone. So if you would, Norm, please tell us a little bit about your background. How did you become how did you meet Dr. Paul and get involved with Campaign for Liberty?
I was first became familiar with Dr. Paul in the late 80s, 87 and 88, when he was running for president of the Libertarian Party nomination. I'd studied economics in college and was fortunate to have a Austrian, not Austrian the country, but the Austrian School of Economics professor who, and through that, I discovered Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, Rothbard, and the libertarian philosophy, and I realized that was what I was. And then I found out that this former Republican congressman was running for the Libertarian Party president, and really became an admirer of Ron's. And after that, I always thought, because I went on to law school and then went into the professional world, I always kind of wished that there was another Ron Paul in Congress. So in 95, after the Gingrich revolution, Dr. Paul decided to return to Congress. I'd heard about that. I was working for a liberty organization in the DC area at the time, and I called some friends that I knew who were working or who had worked with Ron in the past on various projects. I arranged to do some work for his congressional campaign, and afterwards he hired me to be a legislative assistant. I became legislative director in 2001. Coincidentally, my first week as legislative director, the House was shut down because of you remember the anthrax panic, and I stayed there till the end of 2012 through a whole lot of changes. When you think about what politics in the world was like in 1997 versus today, I think when I started with Ron, the idea that I'd be sitting here on an iPhone conversing on YouTube, that was not something that was we could do back then. And then, of course, the changes in the Liberty Movement, Dr. Paul's run for president in 2008, and what that sparked. And so after he resigned from Congress, he asked me to stay with him as working for his Campaign for Liberty, which was a grassroots organization that he founded in the aftermath of the 2008 campaign. The idea being to kind of take what had begun with that campaign and make it a permanent force in American political life. It's devoted to his ideals of limited government, individual liberty, free markets, and a non-interventionist foreign policy.
You've covered a little bit about how the organization got started. I guess, what was it like working with him, and what is your role? What is Campaign for Liberty's primary mission or role?
Our primary role is basically mobilization of grassroots activists. There's a lot of good organizations doing great work educating people about the ideas of liberty. We work to take the already educated and get them involved in pressuring members of Congress to move toward a liberty direction. At least personally for me, one of the goals of Campaign for Liberty is summed up by a great quote from Milton Friedman, which is that our goal should not be to elect a bunch of good people to office because that's probably not going to happen. Our goal should be to create a political and intellectual climate where even the bad people feel compelled to vote with us. And that's Campaign for Liberty's goal, is to make sure that politicians understand that there's a threat to their survival as politicians. And don't be clear, I'm just talking about their survival as holding elected office, in case anybody from the NSA is listening and has any ideas. The idea, though, here is that by putting pressure on politicians, that's how you get them to move in a pro-liberty direction. Education is very important, but to try to convince an elected official or a staffer that you should do the right thing because here's a white paper, versus having the saying you should do the right thing because you just got 500 phone calls telling you to do the right thing. The later one's going to be more effective, especially when you have a bunch of lobbyists and a bunch of pressure groups and a bunch of left-wing organizations mobilizing pressure from the other side. And B, you have the fact that unfortunately there is an authoritarian gene almost in people who come to DC, that they actually they think that the right thing to do involves giving them power. Dr. Paul tells a great story about a time that he was talking to someone on the floor, and he said, "How could you vote for this bill? It's anti-liberty. It's unconstitutional." He said, "Well, Ron, we can't allow the people to do this, and we need to stop them for their own good." And that paternalistic attitude, you find that on both left and right. And again, the only way to overcome that, or the most effective way to overcome that, is through grassroots pressure, and that's what Campaign for Liberty exists to do.
Norm, can you elaborate a little bit on how you think lobbying influences politics, and how lobbying has affected Campaign for Liberty, if at all?
Well, lobbying is a it's a dirty word, but I think that another word for lobbying is freedom of speech. It's a way of mobilizing and exercising your right to freedom of speech under the First Amendment. The problem with it is that by the nature of politics, when you have a welfare warfare state and you have a regulatory state where the government is exercising so much control of the economy, it's natural that there's going to be a lot of lobbying for special favors. It's also natural that it's going to be easier to get your phone call returned if you represent a big corporation, if you represent a union with that employs 50,000 people in a congressional district, or 500,000 people in a state. And even if you're just a constituent, a small business, or just a average American, you might get a call back from your congressional office. You might actually get called back first on some occasion, as opposed to the K Street representative of the big business. But who do you think is going to be listened to more carefully? And that's just the nature of the system. And this is one of the problems with big government. But there's nothing wrong with lobbying per se. I think, though, the type of lobbying that we do, I'm not a lobbyist. I'm an organizer of grassroots lobbying. I'm under no illusion that the reason they audit the Fed, for example, is close to passage is because Campaign for Liberty's efforts inside the Beltway. It's because of that grassroots army of all those libertarians that sprung up in 2000, 2008, and then in 2012, who decided to become involved with Campaign for Liberty after Dr. Paul's campaign. It's the fact that there are so many people who are willing to pressure their representatives. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Also, can you explain to our viewers what is your educational background and experience, and what is your view of the legal system currently as it stands today?
Well, I do actually have a JD from the University of Pittsburgh. Uh, I graduated in 1990. I have a bachelor's from a small school called Washington and Jefferson in Washington, Pennsylvania, in economics. My view of the legal system is that it's like every other part of our country, of our system of government. Our legal system today has been corrupted by the entitlement mentality and by an erosion of the fundamental principles of the common law, of the rule of law that the country was founded upon. I think that it's also the biggest threat is too is you have because of the growth of the welfare state, the warfare state, and most importantly in the legal system, the growth of things like the war on drugs, the war on uh, any on which has turned into a war on privacy, a war on cash, and a war on even private property, and a war on the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, certainly. And then you have the war on terrorism, which has furthered that, and things like the erosion of basic due process rights, the erosion of our right to privacy, the fact that I'm holding again, I'm doing this on a cell phone. I don't know uh, who is listening to the cell phone, and under the Patriot Act, it's very difficult to find out. A good example of the erosion of our basic respect and the corruption involved in the surveillance state. Look at what happened to General Mike Flynn. Uh, I I'm not going to comment on whether or not his connections with or alleged connections with Russia justified his removal from office, but what I think is more frightening than any paranoid theory that the left wants to spin about Donald Trump being some kind of agent for Putin and Flynn being a Kremlin Manchurian candidate is the fact that the National Security Advisor was removed because the deep state abused Section 702 of the FISA Act to gather dirt on him under the pretense of gathering dirt on foreign citizens that he was talking to. If they can do that to the National Security Advisor, how can any of us say that we're safe? And there's proposals to expand that. 702 is not going to be repealed. It might be, quote, reformed, unquote, just like we had the so-called Freedom Act, which actually was supposed to be a great reform of civil liberties and to rein in some of the Patriot Act powers. When you look at the details, all it did was it outsourced the collection of metadata and service. It said that instead of the NSA doing it themselves, Verizon and AT&T will do it for them, and they'll store it. And so it basically brought a new level of cronyism to spying. You have a proposal floating in Congress called the Restoration of America's Wired Act, which bans internet gambling, and that's going to give the surveillance state a whole new reason to snoop on someone. And if I'm gambling and your names are in my email contact list, that there's a chance that you could be swept up in a surveillance state operation against me. And that is being done to please one powerful donor, Sheldon Adelson, who owns brick and mortar casinos himself and doesn't want to be to compete with online businesses. Look at the stories we hear about civil asset theft, where the government just takes your property because you've been accused of a crime. And again, if I'm renting a room to Tom, and Tom, unbeknownst to me, is dealing cocaine out of my house, I can lose my house to the government, and I can lose my house to the government, even if the government will never bring a charge against me for being involved in drug dealing or if I'm found innocent of the charge under a jury, because the standard for taking property in a lot of jurisdictions, I believe, is much lower than guilty until, or innocent until proven guilty. Sorry for that screw up there, but actually guilty until proven innocent. It might be a better description of a lot of our so-called legal system today than the traditional innocent until proven guilty.
Don't you wonder a lot of times how these laws get passed? I mean, something like civil asset forfeiture, how can the government take people's property if you haven't been charged and convicted of a crime? It's really just mind-blowing.
Because civil liberties for many years took a backseat in public debate to demagoguery and fear. You had, starting in the 70s, it was an easy way for politicians to stand up and say, we've got to crack down on drugs. On the left, it was for many years until the gun lobby became able to stop this and kind of turn the debate around to say, we've got to crack down on guns. And then, of course, after 9/11, and I was on the Hill, and the Patriot Act was passed. And I remember the atmosphere was you literally had members on the floor of the House saying that unless we pass the Patriot Act as desired by the administration immediately, we will have more terrorist attacks by the end of the week. And in a state of fear, in a state of panic, in a state of, oh my God, government has to do something to stop drugs, to stop terrorists, to stop guns. And then in the economic side, the atmosphere after the meltdown was kind of like the Patriot was. It was a lot like the atmosphere after 9/11, in that there was a panic. There was, oh my God, the economy is collapsing. We need to give government more power. And very few people stopped to say, well, what about the Constitution? What about the root causes of this problem? What about, in the case of terrorism, what about this thing called blowback? That maybe what we should do is to prevent future terrorist attacks is stop a foreign policy that acts as Osama bin Laden's best recruiter. In the case of the economic meltdown, maybe it's the system of fiat money and Federal Reserve, and actually it's regulation that favors big banks and Wall Street firms, and actually helps to consolidate power at the top of the economic ladder and contributes to economic income inequality and crony capitalism. Because at that point, politicians don't want to think. That one of the most difficult things for people in DC to do is to take a deep breath and say, should I say maybe the country, the people in the world will be better off if, instead of trying to run their lives, run the economy and run the world, I just stand here and don't do anything.
Norm, too, if I can interject one thing, you just kind of hit on about blowback with foreign policy, and that reminds me of a video I saw not too long ago when Dr. Paul, I can't remember if it was the 2008 or 2012 campaign, and he was in a debate, Rudy Giuliani and others, and he mentioned that. He says, the reason we're having these domestic attacks is because there's going to be blowback. He said that, and Rudy Giuliani was taken back, and he said to Dr. Paul, he says, you're saying it's our fault. I'm going to ask that you rescind that ticket.
Yeah.
As much as he didn't like it, it's true. I mean, why these things happen? I mean, this just doesn't fall out of the sky. And so whether you like Dr. Paul or not, he's correct analysis.
Exactly right. And the blowback moment, the Giuliani moment, that was actually one of the moments that kind of jump-started Ron's 2008 run and led a lot of people to kind of be attracted to him, his message, and start to rethink things. And what was really interesting to me about that was, first was the fact that Ron was actually, in his follow-up to Giuliani, and the Fox News anchor, who is clearly very biased against Dr. Paul's argument, was that Ron said that this was actually from the CIA, who had written many documents saying that, look, this is the problem, is our foreign policy is making enemies. And the CIA is, whatever you think of them, or even if you think that they should even exist in a limited government republic, they're not known for being composed of left-wing peaceniks. And the other thing that kind of amused me about Rudy saying, Mayor Giuliani's response was that he said that he's never heard of Ron's the theory that Ron was proposing at that point. And he said, I've heard some pretty weird or crazy explanations for 9/11. Well,
right.
Rudy,
right.
As Ron pointed out, as Dr. Paul said to you in his rebuttal, this is something from the CIA. There's been a lot of books written by very smart people, very knowledgeable in foreign policy. There's actually was a book by, I want to say Chambers Johnson, maybe, called Blowback, that was published a few months before 9/11. Scholarly historical work. You're running to be a chief executive, and you're not even from you don't necessarily have to agree with the theory, but if you want to be chief executive and you're running as an expert on national security, on the root causes of terrorism, and you don't know Blowback, you can't intelligently discuss it because you're not familiar with the theory, but you've heard some weird explanations for 9/11. That to me was a very telling sign of kind of the fact that this was not even of the thinking of a lot of the neoconservative foreign policy thought that this theory promulgated by the CIA didn't even fit into their worldview. It wasn't even worthy of their taking time to consider, thinking about, or learn about.
It's definitely surprising for somebody who's intelligent and educated and running, like you said, for the highest office in the United States. So how do you think the libertarian movement and libertarianism is currently playing out and affecting what's currently going on in the political atmosphere right now in DC?
It's a mixed bag. President Trump, when he ran for president, had some libertarian proposals, policies. In the foreign policy arena, a lot of us were very glad to see that he was rejecting neoconservatism, rejecting nation building. Domestically, he was he seemed to be on regulations. He seemed to be not too bad, and he was a critic of Janet Yellen. At sometimes his criticism of the Fed is sounded like they came from Dr. Paul almost. And he did promise to support the Audit the Fed bill. Since he's been elected, it's been kind of a mixed bag. On regulatory reform, he's been very good. His early executive orders, his regulatory freeze, his hiring freeze, those are really good first starts. We'll see what happens now. I think the time frame of those orders is coming to an end. On Obamacare, it's obviously not good. He was elected in large part, and the Republicans control Congress in large part because of millions of Americans who've seen their premium spike, have lost access to doctors that they choose, or having trouble getting and maintaining quality health care because of this law. And the best the Republicans can come up with is a bill that basically retains almost all of Obamacare and then says to the states, you can come up with your own mini Obamacare, which is what the so-called waivers basically comes down to. You won't have to participate in big Obamacare. On foreign policy, he seems to be backtracking. For a guy who is supposedly, if you listen to the Democratic Party and watch too much MSNBC, you believe that Donald Trump is, again, a Manchurian candidate or a Putin business partner almost. He's moving into the direction of wanting of using Cold War era rhetoric to talk about Vladimir Putin, a guy who is by no means a libertarian, by no means a friend of liberty, but on the other hand, he's not the Soviet Union. But the rhetoric that emanates from our foreign policy, from large sectors of our foreign policy community, would suggest he is. And unfortunately, it seems like Trump, despite his campaign rhetoric about seeing the benefit of a peaceful, friendly relationship with Russia, is moving in that direction. You know, the unilateral bombings of Syria indicate that he's going to be continuing to pursue the imperial presidency, and the idea that the president can go to war without so much as a bayou leave from Congress, and that because it's a Congress of his own party makes it even easier for presidents to get away with that type of thing in foreign policy. And then we have Audit the Fed, and this is where I think he's really been disappointing. He hasn't even said the words Audit the Fed since he was elected, despite making an explicit promise in his campaign that he would back it as a president. It was a quote where he said, "Within 100 days of my presidency, the Fed will already will be audited." Now, obviously, that's kind of a difficult promise to fulfill, because even if if Congress passed and he signed the bill on day one of his presidency, the audit might not be able to be started and completed within the next 99 days. But still, that was a strong statement. He's gone back on his criticisms of Janet Yellen. And so I would say that in the crucial area of monetary policy, he's been a very disappointment. In foreign policy, he seems to be on track to become another Bush-Obama hyper-interventionist, and that's very disappointing. In economic policy, the regulatory stuff does remain a very good and solid accomplishment of Donald Trump and this Congress. We'll see where he goes on for the rest of the term on tax reform, and also if Congress and the president do act on Audit the Fed, and also see what happens with Obamacare, which is a tremendously awful bill that is really just destroying America's healthcare system. And for the Republicans to not put forth a serious proposal is really a betrayal of one of the key reasons why they were put in charge in the first place.
Norm, can you explain to our viewers what Audit the Fed is and what it's about?
Yes.
And one thing, if I can, before you answer, I'm actually reading a book by another author, and it mentions that Audit the Fed is a private organization, dollars every year. None of it is to, I don't know if she said to pay the U.S. government or something like that, but certainly she mentions the Audit the Fed is a private organization. If you could, answer that question in addition to Sarah's, I think that would be very informative for our viewers.
There's a lot of people who say, I think that the Fed has a governing structure, and they are more independent of the federal government than your average agency, than say like the Department of Education or the Pentagon, but they are part of the United States government. They're set up with 12 regional banks, and they do have both a role as a regulator and a role as a monetary policy. Congress had in the 70s explicitly forbidden the General Accounting Office, which is in charge of doing kind of the watchdog agency, and it does the audits that are authorized by Congress. Congress has walled off most of its monetary policy functions from the Federal Reserve, and what this means is that when the Federal Reserve Chairman testifies before Congress, which the 1978 Humphrey Hawkins Economic Stabilization Act, I think something like that was the official title, required them to do. Congress is basically operating in the dark because they don't have all the information about how they can conduct monetary policy. Imagine Congress conducting an oversight hearing with Betsy DeVos, and they weren't allowed to see large swaps of information of how the Department of Education was implementing No Child Left Behind or promoting Common Core. This is kind of like what the situation you have with the Federal Reserve. So Audit the Fed, it's a simple one-page bill that just repeals those sections and says that the General Accounting Office is able to look at the Federal Reserve's open market transactions, notes of its meetings, its dealings with foreign central banks and foreign governments. It doesn't necessarily put us on a path to ending the Fed, although a lot of us think that it probably will. Once we see all this information, there's going to be a huge increase of people saying, why is this bank allowed to do all this stuff? Why does it have all this power? And one of the reasons why I think that is because, you know, the Snoop state loves to tell us, if you don't have anything to hide, you have nothing to fear. Well, I think that actually should apply to the government. If the government doesn't have something to hide, they shouldn't have anything to fear. They shouldn't fear Edward Snowden or Julian Assange. And the Federal Reserve should not fear Ron Paul, Rand Paul, and Thomas Massie and the Audit the Fed bill, because you say that you're doing great and that the world economy couldn't function without you. Yet at the same time, you say that if we allow you, if we know all the full truth about your operation, then the world economy will collapse, and also that this is just a conspiracy by a bunch of libertarians to build popular support for ending your existence. That seems a little contradictory to me, and to me, your arguments against the Federal Reserve and its lobbyist cronies' arguments against Audit the Fed are actually strengthen the case for passing Audit the Fed. So I actually should probably thank the Fed. And its
that's exceptionally sound logic.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Paul likes to say there's two arguments that never win the day in D.C., which is the moral and the constitutional. Sometimes I think you could also add the logical to that list.
Final question for you. I guess, what would you characterize as the top problems affecting America, or that you're working on at Campaign for Liberty?
Well, I would say that you could probably put everything into one big problem, into one issue, which is loss of respect for individual liberty and limited government, and replacement with a mentality that says that the United States government, and then you even have it at the state and local level, is the savior of individuals and the world. And the idea that we can get physical and economic security for ourselves and our families and our businesses from government programs, government regulations, and that the world can be made a peaceful and harmonious place via a hyper-interventionist U.S. foreign policy. Benjamin Franklin famously said, those who trade liberty for security will get neither. And today we're trading liberty for security in all areas, and we see it just getting worse and worse and worse. And we're in a situation too where I think that we should have a major concern, where if you look at the social strife, if you look at the political violence which is coming to the United States, and at times during the I don't want to engage in hyperbole, but I'm going to anyway. At times during the last campaign, there were almost hints of kind of a Weimar Germany atmosphere, because you had authoritarian groups on the right fighting authoritarian groups on the left, and since the election, you've really seen violence being addressed by, oddly enough, by those who act in the name of anti-fascism, but they have no problem in advocating violence against their political opponents, which is an authoritarian tactic, and it's also a sign of when a welfare state is kind of in its dying days, and that usually means it's going to be replaced by something worse. And if you look at the entitlement mentality, if you look at the social strife that's going on, if you look at the rise of kind of the intolerance on the left of the social justice warriors who everything is a trigger warning to them. And if you look on the right, there's also the rise of the alt-right and other more authoritarian type of social movements that are explicitly anti-libertarian in many cases. When the economy, when the next economic downturn comes, it's very easy to imagine a situation where the country collapses into complete authoritarianism as a result of the breakdown in the social order caused by a Federal Reserve and congressionally created economic collapse. The good news is that there's still time. We still do have freedom of speech in this country. We still do have the right to organize and mobilize. We still have the right to educate. I would say, Tom, that you and Sarah are doing great work on the legal system. I hope that everyone who listens to this buys their book. I hope that everyone who listens to this forwards it to friends, family, neighbors, relatives, and helps to educate them on the need for them to get involved in the liberty movement. Hopes that they buy your book, that they buy multiple copies of your book, actually, and distribute it to their friends and relatives and coworkers, so that other people can learn about the dangers of our legal system, and that also, of course, they go to campaignforliberty.com and get involved in our efforts to audit the Fed, to repeal the Patriot Act, to repeal Obamacare, and protect all of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Absolutely, Norm. Thank you very much. That's a very, very flattering compliment. And I was just going to ask you in closing for your website, campaignforliberty.com.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to wrap the show by, tell our viewers to catch our show fresh every first Monday of the month at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, or you can view it here afterward right here on our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our blog for informative monthly posts at www.stloiyf.com/blog. And if you want to protect yourself to the fullest extent possible against our wildly corrupt system, our wildly corrupt legal system, be sure to pick up a copy of our book, Stack the Legal Odds in Your Favor, as Norm has so kindly just mentioned. And please use the link below this video to support our partner, a very great partner, Campaign for Liberty. Oh, this video, you'll be supporting their cause and doing great, great work as well. So once again, Norm, this has been an exceptionally fascinating discussion. Thank you as well for the work that you and everyone else is doing at Campaign for Liberty. We hope, again, as you just mentioned, that people see this video, they do look and they do support Campaign for Liberty to the fullest extent possible. And of course, we thank you so much for the interview today. It's been exceptional.
Thank you, Norm, so much for coming and agreeing to be on our show, and thank you for your good work and for everyone's work at Campaign for Liberty. We really appreciate your partnership, and thank you again for coming on the show.
I appreciate partnership too. It's great to be on the show.